Hey guys, this is a video response to Confused Matthew's review of Finding Nemo. Now, before I begin, I should probably clarify a couple of things. First of all, I'm a big fan of Confused Matthew. I think he's a great reviewer. I don't agree with his Lion King review. I don't agree with his Back to the Future Part 2 review. I can kind of understand his problem with 2001: A Space Odyssey, but I don't really agree with that review either. And I not only don't agree with his No Country for Old Men review, I don't even really understand what the problem is in that review. But otherwise, I think he's a great reviewer, and I always enjoy watching him. And I absolutely love his favourite movie review feature. That's been really fascinating. I think I actually enjoy Confused Matthew a lot more when he's talking positively about films. I think he has a lot more to say. I find him a lot more interesting and a lot more knowledgeable about the way the films work. Those are probably the more interesting reviews now. When he first announced this feature, about a year ago, I decided, okay, I'm going to have to do a response, I think, to one of these, because it would just be kind of interesting. There's been so many responses to his negative reviews that it might be kind of interesting to just turn the tables and do a response to one of his positive reviews. I wasn't really sure which one I was going to do a response to at first, because most of them I absolutely love as well. I share Matthew's love for. The only films that he originally listed on there that I wasn't absolutely loving were Moulin Rouge, Pan's Labyrinth, and this film, obviously. Not that I dislike any of those films. I do like all three of those, but I just don't think they're anything particularly special. But Moulin Rouge, I think, is probably just simply not really my thing. I think it's a good film, but it's not for me. Pan's Labyrinth, it just didn't interest me that much. It just didn't strike me as anything particularly special that much, but I don't really have anything about it that I particularly disliked. It just, didn't do anything for me. But this film, there were sort of things that stood out for me as problems and flaws that meant that it wasn't as good as it could have been. Again, I don't dislike this film. I think it's actually quite a good film. There just are a lot of problems with it, if you ask me. The bigger thing that kind of has me scratching my head about why Matthew would do a favourite movie review of this is the fact that he considers this the best of the Pixar films. I cannot for the life of me understand how he could consider this film even close to being as good as WALL-E or Ratatouille or Up or any of the Toy Story films. The only two Pixar films I've seen to date that I disliked with two Cars films. I thought A Bug's Life was okay, and then after that I think would probably be Finding Nemo, just ahead of those three films, probably on par with Brave and Monsters Inc. as just sort of good films, but there's certainly nothing about them that's particularly special, nothing really groundbreaking or anything that pushes the boundaries in any kind of major way. There's no point watching this video if you haven't, first of all, already seen Finding Nemo, and also if you haven't already seen Matthew's review of Finding Nemo. I will put links in the description to Matthew's review of Finding Nemo, put links to all 4 videos of that review. Let's get to maybe some of the very basic problems I think I have with this film before I get to maybe some of the things that Matthew actually said in the review. I don't really think there's a particularly strong reason why this film is fish. I get the feeling in the writer's room when they were first coming up with the idea with this film, the idea for the basic premise for this film came along, and then later on came the idea that they just make it fish, basically for the sake of it. There aren't really that many times in the film, I think, where they actually use the fact that it's fish, or the fact that it's fish is the reason why the story is being told the way it is. It does make it easier for them not to be a villain, I think. That is maybe one advantage it has, and I think the other time when they use the fact that it's fish is when Dory gets rescued at the end, with the fishing net. But with other Pixar films, I get the impression that they made the situation what it is because it fitted with the story. Ratatouille, for example, it's sort of the idea, can you imagine being someone who's interested in cooking and being a chef and being very creative with food, but also coming from, a background of people that just aren't particularly picky about their food? A rat fits that description perfectly. Being a rat that's interested in cooking, it's just the perfect kind of mismatch for that kind of thing. It fits the story, that kind of situation. Up would be another one that it works really well. Can you imagine being an old man, who kind of is not really physically able and doesn't really have the willpower to really do anything with his life now, but at the same time he kind of does want to do things with his life. He just doesn't have the willpower and he doesn't have the energy anymore because he's old. So he kind of wants to go out there and do things, but he also doesn't really want to leave his armchair and he doesn't want to leave his house. So what if his house could fly and he could travel the world without having to leave his house? That is how the sort of situation in Up comes about, because it fits with the story that they want to tell. With Finding Nemo, for the most part, it could really just have easily been people. It's a father who's overly protective of his son. His son gets taken away somehow and he has to go and rescue him. help of a comic relief companion, and along the way he learns to become a better father. There's nothing about that story that really says, well, it needs to be fish then. One person, I think, has pointed out to me that it is possible, by making it fish, not to have a villain in the story, but I don't think that's the reason they made it fish. I don't think there's any requirement in any kind of story that you're telling, whether it's a kids' film or not, that the story cannot have a villain. I certainly don't like this attitude that a lot of Hollywood writers seem to have now, that a story does need to have a villain by default or something, that they try to force a villain in there when one isn't necessary. But I also don't want them to take the complete opposite approach and say, oh, we can't possibly have a villain in this. I don't really like the idea that they made it fish just so they couldn't have a villain. I think they wanted to tell a story about an overly protective father who learns to become a better father, or if the way that they wanted to tell that story called for a villain, they would have put a villain in there. So I don't think that's the reason they made it fish. I think they made it fish just because they thought it would be cool, and it would look nice, and it would make for some cool CGI effects, which it does, to be fair. It is by far and away the best looking of the Pixar films in terms of animation and the way it looks and just visually. That is one department where this is most definitely the best of the Pixar films. Okay, so now we're going to go through maybe a few of the things that Matthew said in part 1 of his review. And the first thing he says is, to date, Pixar has never made a bad film. Not much to say about this statement, except I would completely disagree with that. I thought the two Cars films were absolutely terrible. I thought Cars 2 was noticeably worse than Cars, but they were both pretty bad. Cars would be a 3 out of 10 for me, and Cars 2 probably a 1 out of 10. The next thing he states is very much a question of how Dory could be a character with short-term memory loss, and her short-term memory loss would remain consistent throughout the film. And then he says, as we will see, they absolutely do make it consistent. And unfortunately, he never really sort of properly explains exactly what he means by this. This consistency of short-term memory loss is justified by what we see in the film. I gotta say, I never really got the impression that her short-term memory loss was noticeably consistent. The more consistent character trait I saw in Dory was more that she was just sort of not really caring how much peril they may be in, or how awful a thing may have just happened or may be about to happen. She just sort of enjoyed the moment of life. That maybe was an element of her short-term memory loss, that she doesn't really remember how they got into a situation, or what just happened, or why a situation they're in might be dangerous, or why a situation they could be in later on might be dangerous. I don't know if that directly relates back to her short-term memory loss. I always thought that her short-term memory loss was in there mostly as just comic relief, really. But I never really got the feeling that it was present for a large part of the film, really. I found it very easy to sort of just forget that she had short-term memory loss. It was not a particularly prominent feature of her character. It was there as sort of a gag when she's first introduced, and then you've got the whole sort of the address on the back of the mask that she takes a lot of satisfaction from being able to remember. It never really became a particularly prominent trait of her character, really. I do love the character Dory. She's by far my favourite character of this film, and if they make a sequel, which I think is rumoured, I think I would like to see her be the main character. And actually, I think what would be a better idea, actually, if they were going to make a follow-up film for this one, would actually be to make a prequel and make Dory the main character of that. So yeah, Dory is a great character, but her short-term memory loss, I never really got the impression that that was sort of a major trait of her character that was sort of made very prominent throughout the film and made particularly consistent, so I'm not quite sure what he's getting at there. The next thing he says, each character has a specific problem that they need to overcome. Marlin is the emotional one of being overly protective of Nemo, Dory is the mental issue of her short-term memory loss, and Nemo is the physical problem of having a gimpy fin, the lucky fin as they refer to it. And each character will take a journey to overcome their own problem. Okay, with Marlin, obviously I agree. That's the sort of central plot of the entire film, the way he learns to become a better father. Dory, I kind of see a little bit of that in the satisfaction she takes from remembering what the address on the back of the mask was. Again, never really saw much of an arc with her in terms of any kind of resolution to her character. It was more just a sort of taking a little bit of satisfaction from remembering the address on the back of the mask. And with Nemo, I definitely did not see any kind of evolution or progress with his character, or really much in terms of him really sort of learning anything. It's certainly not anything that related to his physical disability of having, a gimpy fin. What I actually found more interesting, with Nemo is that the last thing he says to Marlin before they are separated is "I hate you." Something I actually kind of liked at the time when I first saw that film. I really sort of was interested by that, because that's quite a sort of powerful thing to put in a kid's film. Can you imagine? I'm not a parent myself, but can you imagine as a parent having your child that you've done your absolute hardest and you put so much passion your entire life into raising them in what you think is the right way, to have them say that to you? That has to be just such an emotionally draining thing, and so demoralising to have them say that. Unfortunately, Matthew doesn't mention it, and I would have been interested to see what he had to say about that, because my big problem, I think, once this film ended, was that they never really did anything with that. Nemo mentions, when they get reunited at the very end, "I don't hate you." But again, there's no acknowledgement of it. There's nothing really comes of it. It's just sort of a sort of boomerang. Oh, you remember it back at the beginning of the film when Nemo says, "I hate you"? Well, now he doesn't hate him. That's it. That's all they do with that entire plot point, really. They could have done a lot more with it. And instead there's more of an emphasis on a much softer kind of reason for them to get reunited, which is Nemo asking Marlin, "How old are sea turtles?" And then along the way Marlin finds out how old sea turtles are, and he tells him at the end. It's a much lighter kind of thing. And again, like I said before, he emphasises the fact throughout part one about how there's no villain. I like the fact that there's no villain. I don't, like I said before, I don't like the idea that every story, particularly kids' stories, must have villains. I don't like the idea of forcing a villain in there. But conversely, I don't really think a story not having a villain is anything particularly commendable. Hell, Dumbo, made all the way back in 1941. Was it 41? Well, it was certainly back in the 40s at some point. That didn't have a villain, so it's not like this is a particularly new thing for kids' films to not have villains. So I don't think it's any kind of major accomplishment that you have to commend and you have to emphasise in some kind of major way and use as a flag to wave above the head and say, "Oh, isn't this wonderful? There's no villain and it's a kids' film. Isn't that just so original?" It's not. It's just sort of normal. It's like trying to congratulate a kid for looking both ways when they cross the road. It's just what they're expected to do, what they're supposed to do. So I just want to talk a little bit more about the evolution of Nemo's character, or in my opinion, lack thereof. Basically, he comes across this character in the fish tank called Gill, who poses very much as the father figure to Nemo while he's in the tank. And obviously he is the complete opposite end of the spectrum. I actually did like this part of Matthew's review. He talks very much about how Gill is the complete opposite end of the spectrum when it comes to the way you raise your children. Marlin is completely overly protective of Nemo, and Gill is at the opposite end. He just lets Nemo do everything. And the message of the film is not to be protective of your children, it's more to find a sort of medium. It's to not be too protective of children, but not just let them do anything as well. I like Marlin's side of that story. I'm not entirely sure if they really did everything they could have done with the sort of relationship between Nemo and Gill. Because Gill never actually meets Marlin. I think this could have worked a lot better if the two of them had met at some point and the two opposites collide, so to speak. I also never got the impression that there's any kind of rift between Nemo and Gill, because Gill just goes around and lets Nemo do everything. So, again, I don't really think they do enough with this idea of having Gill learn not to just let Nemo go off and do things on his own. It also didn't really make as much... The actual way in which Gill learns his lesson doesn't actually make much sense to me. Obviously, he has Nemo go into the filter to try and escape from the tank, and it goes wrong, and Nemo is almost killed. And Gill obviously feels very bad. He just threw Nemo in there without really even consulting him about whether or not he was okay with this whole thing, or even explaining to him that it might possibly be dangerous. But the thing is, since Gill never meets Marlin and he never goes out of the dentist's office throughout the entire film, he isn't really a particularly sort of central or prominent character to the whole sort of grand scheme of what's going on in this film, the sort of grand story of it all. Again, since he never actually meets Marlin or, has any consequence outside of, just this little escaping from the tank thing, I don't really think there's much of a point to Gill learning a lesson, other than maybe that he represents the opposite end of the spectrum of being protective or not being protective of your kids. I don't really think they do anything like that. I think they would have been better off if Nemo were the one that learnt this lesson. That maybe they established at an earlier point that Nemo just wanted to go off and do everything and not have any sort of acknowledgement of the consequences or anything like that. And then maybe have Nemo learn for himself that maybe it isn't such a good idea to go off and do things. But of course, I suppose the problem with that is it's not a lesson in parenting at that point. It's just a lesson in being more cautious as a kid. Matthew actually does sort of try to claim in his review that by Gill learning this lesson about not just letting Nemo go off and do his own thing, Nemo is also learning this lesson, but I never really got that impression. Nemo really doesn't do anything when this whole situation comes around. He sort of apologises for not being able to stop the filter and mopes about, not really doing anything for the rest of the time, and Gill just sits there feeling sorry for himself. The other problem with this whole plot point for me was the idea that Nemo basically is dead if he doesn't get out of this tank by Friday, because he's going to be sent off to this little girl called Darla. I don't quite understand why Gill doesn't think it's worth, at least giving the filter plan another shot, because obviously there's the danger of Nemo being killed in the filter if they try again. But if Nemo doesn't get out of the tank, he's basically dead anyway. Now, people have pointed out to me that it's possible that, Gill thinks he has a chance with Darla, maybe a chance of surviving. But from what I saw, it didn't look to me like he had much of a chance, the amount that she was shaking the bag in the actual film, when he actually does get bagged up. The only other thing I can think about why maybe Gill isn't willing to give the filter plan another shot, just because of the dangers of it, is possibly because if Nemo is sent off to Darla and Darla ends up killing him, that I suppose is something that Gill couldn't really do anything about. He didn't ask Darla to come along, he didn't ask her to behave in that manner. It's just one of those things that happens sometimes. As Matthew puts it in his review, sometimes life deals you horrible things. Sometimes these kinds of things just happen, and there is no one to blame. Whereas if Gill sends Nemo back into the filter and he's killed, Gill will have been directly responsible for Nemo's death. So that's the kind of moral dilemma I think that Gill is now faced with. He doesn't want Nemo to be killed, but if it's a choice between Nemo just being sent off to his death or him actually being directly responsible for Nemo's death, he'd take the former. I think if I were Gill, I would not have just sat on my arse and done nothing at this point. I think what I would have done is I would have consulted Nemo about this. I would have said to him, okay, properly explain the situation to him. I'm not going to send you back into the filter unless you absolutely are willing to do it. It was wrong for me to send you into the filter without really properly consulting you or properly explaining the dangers of it. So I'm going to ask you this time, do you want to go back into the filter and give this plan another shot? Do you want to take your chances with Darla, or do you want to try again in the filter? Make it up to Nemo and ask him, does he want to do it? Does he have the courage to do it? I think they're trying to give the impression that Nemo is a little bit of a coward, because he's got this gimpy fin. That's maybe kind of the arc they're going for. Never really sort of properly got that impression as far as I was concerned. He swam out into open water in the early part of the film, just to spite his father without really even thinking about the dangers of it. It doesn't really come across to me that he's particularly cowardly or anything. So, again, that's maybe a character trait or a character arc that they were maybe trying to give the impression of, and I never really got that myself. I don't know, maybe Matthew saw it more than I did. I don't really see that. I have seen this film a number of times, and I never really get the impression that Nemo's being portrayed as a coward or somebody who has some kind of a weakness of his own. All I really get the impression of is that he's just a regular kid that is a little frustrated by the fact that his father's overly protective of him. Focus maybe on a few things that Matthew says in part 2. There's a few things he says maybe about how, the world is a dangerous place and why his father's been protective of him this whole time. I never really got the impression, really, that Nemo was ever doubting why his father was being protective of him or was questioning it at any point. He just got a little frustrated by the fact that his father just emphasised it so much. And now here's something I didn't quite follow what he was trying to say, really. Marlin is fixed on the destination and can't recognise how important the journey is. I don't really see exactly why the journey is important. He's just trying to go and get Nemo. It's like sort of saying, when I, go to pick up my car from the garage, is the journey to the garage important for that? No, the only reason I'm going to the garage is to go and get the car. There's nothing about the journey to the garage that's important. Really have thought to myself, if I were Marlin, that, this is really important. I better sort of take this in as much as possible. So I don't really understand why Marlin should be taking the journey in, or recognising its importance. Marlin is having trust issues with Dory. Yes, that's something I didn't really completely follow. Dory has been informed by this school of fish. They have to swim through a trench rather than over it. And even though she tells this to Marlin sort of flat out and actually is quite sort of insistent about it, Marlin, for whatever reason, just doesn't listen to her. Even when she sort of says, "Oh, come on, like, can't you just trust me?" And Marlin's like, no, I'm not going to trust you. Marlin's a bit of a dick, really, to be honest. Why exactly would he not trust Dory? This comes right after a scene where Dory basically has bailed Marlin out. She's got him the information he needs about where Sydney is, or how to get there anyway. And now suddenly he's completely rejecting everything she's got to say. I don't really understand that. Why is Marlin so insistent that he not trust Dory? Is there really much of a point to having Marlin have this fault in his character? I always thought the fault in Marlin's character was that he was overly protective of Nemo. Now we've got this other fault in Marlin, that he doesn't trust people. Nemo's swimming through the ring of fire in order to become properly part of the tank or something. I've got to be honest, I really didn't like the induction scene into the tank. I thought it was kind of pointless, to be honest, other than Gill explaining the plan of how they were going to escape from the tank. Nemo has to swim through the ring of fire, which is very dangerous. The ring of fire was dangerous? Did you actually... You must have seen that bit, because you actually play that clip in your review. You honestly thought that was dangerous? I mean, Nemo just swims straight through there like it's not even there. Couldn't be any less dangerous. Again, I don't really see throughout this entire film that Nemo really learns anything. We don't really see any point later on in the film where Nemo is faced with the possibility of going into a dangerous situation and decides for himself, "Oh, no, I better not do that." If anything, he's sort of already learned that lesson. It's sort of, his friends at school say to him, "Oh, let's swim out into open water and mess about there," and Nemo's like, better not, really. What are they going for here with the character of Nemo? Is he a coward, or is he someone who just doesn't understand the dangers of the situation? Because I never really got either of those. All I got the impression really was that he was just a regular kid, maybe appreciated, for the most part, what his dad was trying to do and the way he was trying to raise him. He just got a bit annoyed at just how excessive his overly protective nature was. I don't see, again, I keep saying this, I don't see much of a change in Nemo from the beginning of the film to the end of the film. So then we get to this part where Marlin and Dory are swallowed by this whale. I thought Dory speaking whale was pretty funny, actually. In fact, I thought it was probably one of the funniest parts of the film. Dory's humour actually really just carries me through this entire film. It's probably the main reason why I love this. Well, I don't love this film. It's probably the one main reason why I do like this film. It's Dory's comic relief, really sort of carries me through. The bit with the whale, again, Dory speaking whale, very funny. But then the whale sort of eats them, and then they mess around inside the whale for a bit. They have a little bit of a conversation about, how, Marlin can't just sort of not let anything happen to Nemo. It would be a bit boring. And then Dory sort of says, "Oh, we need to go to the back of the throat, and we have to sort of let the whale swallow us." And then the whale spits them out of his blowhole, and they're in Sydney Harbour. I don't quite follow what's going on there. Is Dory actually able to speak whale? And she's told the whale that they need to get to Sydney, and the whale's just like, "All right, I'll give you a lift." I would assume, that Dory is somehow able to speak to the whale, and the whale is somehow able to understand Dory. Blows him out of his blowhole, just to kind of be nice. But Dory speaks whale now suddenly. First of all, she's able to read, now she speaks whale. Where is she picking this stuff up from? That's another big thing, actually, that really sort of bugged me about this film, is Dory's able to read, even though she suffers from short-term memory loss, and now she speaks whale, even though she suffers from short-term memory loss. How does she even remember it if she suffers from short-term memory loss? Another issue I have with the character of Dory, which is, I would like to have seen Dory have a bit more backstory. This is why, if they're going to make a follow-up to this film, I would like it to be a prequel, and maybe give us some backstory to Dory, because I think that's, another thing that was really missing from this film, is I just don't quite follow what Dory's been doing this whole time, why she takes such value in Marlin as a friend, and why she just decides of her own accord to just simply go with him on this adventure. What has she been doing with her life up until this point that made her come to this conclusion? Why is she a loner? Is it just because she suffers from short-term memory loss? Has the fact that she suffers from short-term memory loss put people off wanting her to have anything to do with her? I mean, I suppose Marlin is kind of put off by her a lot of the time, and he does actually sort of ask her to go at one point. I don't really sort of fully understand why just sort of being a little bit irritating at times and suffering from short-term memory loss would just drive everyone away from Dory. I mean, she comes across as a perfectly nice person who just wants to help people. Why is she a loner? Why is she out here on her own, not doing anything with her life, and maybe not being able to do anything with her life? Because is it all just because she suffers from short-term memory loss? Or is it more because, she just enjoys being out on her own? I'm not sort of saying that this is a fault with the film. I would just like to have known the answers to these questions. I would like Dory to have had a bit more backstory and a bit more explanation as to where she's come from, who her family was, who she'd known in her life, why nobody sticks with her. Perhaps not so much a fault with the film as just a way in which the film could have been better, if you ask me. He talks about how Crush is sort of the medium in between Marlin and Gill in terms of being a parent, that sort of Marlin needs to reach. I'm not sure Gill really needs to reach that medium because he's not actually a parent, at least not as far as we ever find out in the film. And he's maybe the sort of the ideal parent that Marlin maybe needed to speak to this whole time. I always assumed Crush really, again, was more just a sort of comic relief character, what with them making him a hippie. If they'd wanted maybe him to come across as more a sort of just regular sort of normal parent, wouldn't he have come across as more of a sort of normal character? More like, Mr. Ray, perhaps. Comes across sort of more kid-friendly and more like the kind of parent kids would like to have. I don't really think we really quite see enough of Crush's actual parenting, really, to get the impression that he is the ideal parent or the medium he needs to reach. Would have liked to have seen a bit more of that. I'm not sure if just that one example was really enough. I would have liked to have seen maybe the kind of opposite approach, maybe of maybe when Squirt is perhaps put in a situation where he genuinely is in danger, and showing that Crush actually, he's not going to just let him go off and do his own thing all the time. He actually is going to try and help him when he feels like he actually does genuinely need his help. Marlin has been holding himself back as much as Nemo, and Dory is the only reason that Marlin has gotten all this way on the journey so far. That is actually a very good point, actually, about the way that Marlin has only gotten where he got all the way to Sydney because of Dory's help. Dory was able to read the mask. Dory, persuades Marlin to swim down into the abyss. Dory speaks to the whale, and Dory is able to persuade Marlin to get out of the whale when they reach Sydney Harbour. Dory speaks to the school of fish to find out how to get to Sydney. Dory comes up with the plan of how to escape the jellyfish forest. It is interesting, actually, now I really think about it. Dory sort of leads the way and comes up with all the ideas of how to get to Sydney. Who exactly is Dory? Why is she so good at just sort of resolving situations like this? Why is she able to lead Marlin into these kind of situations without really much of what could potentially go wrong, and more sort of a thought about what the ultimate goal is? I think maybe she would have gotten people to like her a bit more over the course of her life when she has this kind of attitude and she's this willing to help people out that she doesn't even know that well. The fact that Dory is the reason why they get as far as they do is maybe kind of an indication to me that perhaps this story could have been more interesting if Dory had been the main character. I always got the impression that more of the message really was more just sort of to go out there and hope for the best. And if bad things happen, you can do what you can to try and rectify the situation, but I don't think you should ever try to sort of say anybody's at fault, or anybody's to blame, or you might be to blame, or you could have done something different if you'd acted differently. I do sort of ultimately see that message, but again, I do like the sort of journey that Marlin takes in this film and the character growth he goes through. Perhaps it would have been more interesting for the film to also explore the sort of opposite extreme of that idea, that sometimes you can just get lucky in life. Like maybe the way that Marlin just randomly bumped into Dory the way he did, or the way that they ran into the sharks, the way that he just randomly found the mask. Some people might say that they're faults with the film, that it all happened a little too conveniently, but the film is sort of showing that sometimes massively unfortunate things that no one could do anything about will happen. Sometimes massively convenient things that no one asked for will just happen from time to time. So Matthew attempts to say that the scene Marlin and Dory say goodbye is explaining everything about Dory's character and why she is the way she is. While it is a great scene, and I actually would have liked to have seen a bit more of this kind of thing in the film, I'm not really sure it really sort of properly explains Dory's character. Gives us a little bit of backstory about Dory, the fact that she's been on her own this whole life, perhaps just simply because she suffers from short-term memory loss. She just mentions that no one is willing to stick with her for any decent length of time, and the fact that Marlin has done that means that he means a lot to her. It's a nice scene, but I just would have liked a bit more explanation and a bit more backstory than this. Just this little teaser into her character is just not quite enough. So, of course, we have the fishing net scene where Nemo has the idea to go into the fishing net to save Dory, which brings me back really to the idea that, since Nemo just sort of makes his own way out of the tank without the escape plan that they were originally going to plan, it almost makes me think that maybe the whole thing in the tank really was kind of pointless. I mean, Gill kind of learns a lesson about not just going into dangerous situations and not letting others go into dangerous situations. But again, since he never meets Marlin or Dory and he never really interacts with any other characters other than Nemo and the other fish in the tank, I don't really think that serves much of a purpose in the sort of grand scheme of the story. Because I always consider Marlin to be the main character, and if he never meets the main character, is there really much point to the character of Gill in any sort of vein other than the way that he maybe relates to Nemo? And he doesn't really relate to Nemo in much of a way other than just being a father figure to him while he's in the tank and looking after him. If there'd been more of a rift between Gill and Nemo after the first time that Nemo goes into the tank and Nemo being a bit angry at Gill, perhaps there would have been more to it. And perhaps if Gill had also escaped out of the tank and ultimately he had met Marlin and maybe we'd seen his ideas of what to do with the fishing net situation maybe being something completely different from what Marlin was suggesting, perhaps there would have been more of a point to it. But since Gill just sort of sits in the tank the whole film, I don't really see much of a point to the character of Gill or any of the stuff that happens in the tank. I don't really get the impression that Nemo really learns anything from the experience, other than you have to swim down to escape from a fishing net. That's the only thing he learns. He also, Matthew says, Nemo's physical challenges are overcome. Did he have any physical challenges? I know he's got the gimpy fin, but I didn't really see that impeding him at any point in the film. It's just sort of there. And we also see that Marlin objects to Nemo's idea to help Dory escape from the tank, which basically sort of shows that he hasn't really learnt anything at all until, just a few seconds later when he has this abrupt change of heart. But there's a few sort of minor things about this film, that do kind of bug me, but I think you can probably dismiss them as, cartoon logic, like why didn't Marlin and Dory going down the back of the whale's throat like that cause them to be shot out of the whale's air hole? Is that the way that whales work? Anything that they accidentally swallow, they can spit out of their air hole? There are a few times when we see fish out of water for quite long periods of time. Wouldn't they die from being out of the water that long? Why are Marlin and Dory not crushed under the weight of all that water when they're in the abyss? It seems a little convenient that Marlin would just simply find the mask and it would just happen to have the address where they took Nemo. How Marlin could even be sure that that was the same mask. But with all that stuff, I think you can just, say, this film has talking fish in it, for Christ's sake. It doesn't have to make complete sense. It doesn't have to be completely realistic. So just finally going back to what Matthew has to say in his epilogue. Most of Pixar films have great stories, and explaining why this one stands out above all the rest is kind of hard to explain. Nothing wrong with that, Matthew. I have absolutely no problem with you thinking that this is the best of the Pixar films. Everybody's entitled to their own opinion. Ultimately, really, it just simply boils down to the idea of personal preference. But I commend you for at least attempting to explain it, certainly, because personal preference is certainly something that's very difficult to put into words at times. You can't always explain why a certain film stands above other great films. He basically says that the journey was more important than the destination. Marlin actually learned something along the way. That actually is something I've seen in a lot of films. You do see a lot of hero's journey type films where the hero actually learns something along the way. But I suppose maybe what he's saying there is that the ultimate destination wasn't actually all that important in the end. With most hero journeys, the journey's important, but the destination is more important, if you see what I mean. I sort of try to think of an example. Back to the Future, for example, Marty's able to bond with his parents along the way of trying to get them back together, and he's able to help George gain a bit more confidence. But ultimately that wouldn't have meant anything if not for the ultimate climax of George standing up to Biff and Marty getting back to 1985. The ultimate goal of what they're trying to achieve does end up being, for the most part in most films, the major, main important thing about the film, rather than how they got there. With this film, I suppose what Matthew's saying is how they get there is actually more important than what they actually do when they get there. Marlin learns his lessons along the way. If he hadn't learned his lesson, he would have been reunited with Nemo, but he might have just simply gone back to the way he was before. It is kind of interesting, actually, when you watch the post-title sequence at the start of this film, and then the epilogue sequence at the end of the film. They are very, very similar, so it's very interesting how very little has actually changed. You've got a slightly different attitude from Marlin, and you've got Dory there, obviously, as well. Those are really the only two things that have changed. It's very interesting, this whole massive adventure Marlin's gone on just to make this very slight adjustment to the way he treats Nemo, and obviously, he now has the additional friend of Dory. I do actually kind of like that, I do like films where, you get the feeling at the end that it's not a case of happily ever after, it's more a case of just their lives go on. It's like real life, real life doesn't always have a happy ending, life will just simply go on, take what you've learned from life so far and use it to live your life better in the future. So yeah, I do kind of like the way that, much like The Lion King, the circle of life idea, the ending of the film kind of mirrors the beginning, not quite the beginning actually, the second scene of the film. He then goes on to say that normally in kids' films, the main character has a good quality that no one sees, or it's buried under traumas that they have, whereas here Marlin has more of a fault in his character that simply needs to be fixed. So I think basically what he's saying there is it's just a story of a character learning a lesson. That to me is a fairly common thing you see in films, particularly kids' films, all the time. I just don't quite see how that's a massively original thing. That's something I've seen quite a lot, to be honest. The film touches on serious issues without ever being a downer. Well, it would only be a downer if it was constantly touching on serious stuff. It has some emotional scenes, which I think, worked really well. It just, has comic relief in there as well. The interesting thing about The Incredibles is there isn't really a comic relief character in there. There's no character in there. Edna Mode is a character who sort of comes across as kind of funny, but she's not on screen for that long, really. There's no character that's constantly in there that's constantly cracking jokes. There are kind of amusing or humorous elements to just the way that the family carries on. That's, I think, maybe the comic relief element that Matthew kind of missed from that film, is the way that they, even though they're superheroes, they still behave the way that any family does. And he didn't like the way that the family argues. He doesn't want to see the family fight, he doesn't want to see them argue. That's the joke, though. That's the funny thing about that film. That's the comic relief that he's missing. So he thinks the comic relief is actually a downer. Here I think, he's seeing the comic relief as what it actually is, comic relief. I think that's maybe the different way that he's judged this film in comparison to The Incredibles. He does something he actually doesn't do very often, which is talk about voice acting, how the animation is amazing, which I agree with. I thought Albert Brooks, the lady who does the voice of Dory, who unfortunately I can't remember her name, which is kind of stupid of me, and Alexander Gould as Nemo. And he makes an interesting point about Nemo, the voice acting of Nemo, actually, which is they don't clean up his dialogue. He does sort of splutter and adjust what he's saying from time to time and have to do little awkward or slight pauses from what he's saying. He does genuinely sound like a little kid who's maybe a little excited or not quite sure of himself. That is something kind of cool that they've just left in there. That's really nice. It sounds really natural. And yeah, I agree. The voice acting was great. The animation was outstanding. Some of the best I've ever seen. He says that the moral is sometimes life deals you horrible things. The horrible thing here being a barracuda attacking his wife and killing her and also killing all of their unborn children. Is that really a typical thing that would generally just happen to people on average in life? I think the equivalent would be like a murderer just breaking into your house, killing your wife and killing all your children. That's not something that I think anybody would like to think is just typically sometimes just randomly going to happen. It's certainly not the kind of thing that anybody's going to just shrug their shoulders and just say, these things happen. It's a much more traumatic thing and a much more serious thing, I think, than Matthew's making out, really. But it certainly isn't the kind of reason why you should be overly protective of your children. A murderer coming into your house, if that were to happen, being overly protective of your children isn't going to prevent that from happening. That's actually kind of the thing that maybe Matthew doesn't make particularly clear in his review. Say the barracuda were to come back one day and, try to finish off Nemo as well. It wouldn't matter how overly protective Marlin was of Nemo. he would not be able to prevent the Barracuda from doing that. Whatever horrible things might happen, being overly protective of your children isn't going to prevent those things from happening. I hope I've not pissed anyone off by, giving the impression that I think this film is terrible or anything. I just wanted to sort of touch on a few sort of personal things that kind of bugged me about the film and why I don't really think that this is anything particularly fantastic or outstanding. I just think it's a good film. But obviously, Matthew's entitled to his opinion. It's just simply a case of personal preference. There is absolutely nothing wrong with him feeling the way he does. I can't really disagree with anything he says in the reviews. It just kind of puzzles me, and I just want to sort of make it clear that what he may be trying to get across as maybe some kind of this is the way the film works because I say it does. Just wanted to sort of say, I never really saw it that way, and Matthew may have seen it differently. I don't really understand why he would see it the way that he does, though. This isn't a counter-argument. This is just me sort of trying to give a slightly different, more cynical perspective of this film. Okay, well, I hope I've not rambled on for too long, and I will see you guys soon.